families, creating a lifetime of memories. Sadly, some families are denied these important moments due to the sad practice of alienation. These are families divided.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Families Divided TV. Parental alienation is a social and public health issue, disrupting families and the capacity of parents to fulfill their roles. Parental alienation theory and practice take a stand against anti-family ideologies, seeking to abolish families and radically restructure them to be absorbed by the state and its dominating views. This extreme ideology confronts parents when they engage with family law to remediate alienation in their families, only to find that they are dealing with an unimaginable family concept. Dr. Stan Korosi will talk about the core factors defining these anti-family ideologies and expose their contradiction of using alienation to achieve their so-called utopian goals whilst condemning issues to describe their behavior. Dr. Korosi will also propose how such extreme anti-family ideologues corrupt the concept of the child's best interest by removing the idea of the family and devaluing the child's family relationships. He will also propose what the field of parental alienation should stand for and what it should stand against. All parents, and alienated parents in particular, need to position themselves in a present and future in which families are a network of relationships and power and vulnerable to destruction by alienation. This episode is really off the charts. It's a great episode, much knowledge and much information. Be ready to take notes on all of it. And I want to let you know that we'll be back with Dr. Stan Korosi right after this message.
Divorce and co-parenting are a major life interruption for families, especially the kids, but also for parents and grandparents. And it's even worse in blame-filled, high-conflict cases. When parents engage in alienation by turning the kids against the other parent or grandparents, kids suffer. They're denied the opportunity to build the 4 big skills necessary for future resilience. New Ways for Families online class can help. Parents learn to use our popular BIF and EAR skills to calm the conflict and stop the hostile emails and texts. And we even have a class for kids and parents to learn together. Research shows a 75% improvement in joint parental decision-making after this course is taken, plus overall improvements for kids' well-being. Don't wait to make this affordable investment in your children's future and improve your well-being too. Start learning new ways for your family today at conflictplaybook.com.
Stan Korosi, clinical sociologist here again. In my last podcast, I talked about parental alienation as a cancel culture that no one's talking about. And in that session, I talked about parental alienation as a social problem that's embedded in our society as well as our families. Today, I'm going to talk about the politics of parental alienation, the politics of alienation as a social issue, and how the ideologies and forces of alienation and family ideologies are shaping our families. So we're going to move on now and look at the current state of our society. Where do we stand now? And so in the 1980s, there were some very big changes that followed on from the dislocations and transformations in thinking in the 1960s and 70s. In the 1960s and 70s, there was the dislocations of the Vietnam War, the changes in attitudes towards social institutions. There was the Cold War tensions around mutually assured destruction arising from nuclear war, global nuclear war. And there was the ongoing struggle for women to achieve equity and equality in a fight against oppression, discrimination, and marginalisation. In the 1980s, that thinking coalesced into big changes in the nature of power and the nature of relationships. Historically, we've relied on structural roles. we understood our identity in terms of the social roles we played. The most obvious one being a parent. So being a father, being a mother, being in a family were well understood social roles that had endured historically for decades and centuries. There were other structural roles as well that were built into social institutions that had a sense of solidity about them. They were historically constant, so there's no reason to change them. We had a certainty around who we were. The 1980s saw a transformation in thinking around power that joined it with relationships. So power and relationships began to be called power relationships because they are indivisible from each other. So relationships convey power through narratives, and power conveys relationship through the narratives in which people engage. That's a very fluid way of knowing your reality, of knowing your family. And so what we would say in the 1980s is that fluidity replaced solidity. Things became more uncertain. We started talking about the big issues: climate, gender, race, ethnicity, identity. Some of the ideas and scientific theories even that had been accepted without question up until that time now became contestable. People argued about them. Moving on to the 2000s, and particularly where we are now in the second decade of the 21st century, we're in a different era now. We would call it post-structural, in the sense that we do not have the same trust and sense of enduring social structures like the family, like marriage, and that we rely a great deal more on subjectivity, people's individual views of how they see their reality, rather than relying on scientific objectivity. More importantly, where we are today is the idea that relationships define our identity, rather than who we are being something intrinsic to ourselves or defined in the social roles that we perform. On the one hand, this change saw profound changes in the nature of equity and equality that women had been struggling for decades, if not since a couple of centuries. The price we're paying for that is a great deal of uncertainty and precariousness, that we rely on relationships now to define our identity. And also, the family is now a far more fluid, reconfigurable, uncertain entity. It's not really a family system anymore. It's not really a structure anymore. It's actually a configuration, a network of relationships that are constantly changing. It makes us feel very uncertain who we are. It also makes the family vulnerable to processes like alienation that deconstruct them. So let's move on and look at some of the extreme ideas that are emerging about the nature of families in the 21st century that had their roots in the 1960s and 70s. Now, on the left-hand side, we have some fairly conventional ideas about what a family is and its role in society. Most parents and most families would probably agree with these ideas about the family. And that is that the family is a stable entity, a structuring foundation within society. It's largely independent of the state. Parents bring up their children, socialize their children, nurture their children according to their values and beliefs that interact within the family in family relationships and across families. So the aggregate of families makes up the community and society we know today. The state supports families in the exercise of their responsibilities to their children. So parents have responsibilities about how to bring up their children and a right to do so. And the family, as I said, is independent of the state, but part of the state. In this way of thinking about families, alienation is a threat, because alienation unravels those family relationships destructively and recreates the family according to a dominating ideology that doesn't support the idea that children should be nurtured within a family. On the right-hand side, we see some extreme ideas starting in the 1970s that called for the complete destruction of the marriage and the family as we know it. That idea was based on the problems that women had in that era of getting equity and equality in society and fighting against discrimination. There's no doubt that they were struggling against the oppression of what they would call patriarchy. And so the more they struggled, the more extreme their ideas had to become. Roll forward to this decade in the 21st century, and we have a call for the abolishing the family because it's seen as exploitative. It's seen as being a means of obtaining free labour to bring up children and to provide workers for the state in their capitalist society. In that conception of the family, the state is the family. The state mediates family relationships. Everyone is a client of the state or a welfare recipient of the state. And the family is seen as a threat because it is independent. And it's independent of the dominant ideology around what is the nature of family relationships, who has responsibilities for what. And so we see that tension occur in the interaction between parents seeking remedies for alienation when they engage with family courts, because family courts portray an ideology about the family that most parents would be absolutely unfamiliar with. One of their ways of thinking about the family is that family relationships are not necessarily nurturing to children and that they need not necessarily support those relationships. So in this ideology, alienation is a method for achieving that utopian goal of abolishing the family. At the same time, they decry alienation as a fake science, as a junk science. There's a contradiction there. It's a method on the one hand, but they distract us by claiming that it's an unfounded theory on the other. So what does this mean for families? What is the anti-family view? What are their key factors? But firstly, family relationships are nothing special. Any other relationship can really substitute for that. And so the idea is that children can be brought up in a broader social matrix where the state is the family and families subscribe to whatever ideology the state supports, which in this case, there is no family. We've long known in family law particularly that children are consulted about their views of how they want things to be for them when families separate. Up to a point, there's no problem with that idea, except when the law attributes to the children an adult capacity they don't actually have. There is this concept called mature minors, where children are seen to have their own identity and their own voice. Now that is known as an alienating behaviour, and yet anti-family ideologies support the idea that children not just have a say, but get to decide on their lives when they don't have the capacity to do so. The next key factor is that the family has no longer a key place in society. It's not fit for the purpose it was historically established for, which is to nurture children and develop them. It is a threat to a dominant ideology. It's a threat to the idea that there should be no family. So the existence of the family flies in the face of the ideology that seeks to abolish it. It's also a historical site of oppression, whether it's patriarchal, sexual, or gender. The anti-family view doesn't seem to care about who it harms in pursuit of its ideology. It wants to abolish families. It wants to give children a voice well beyond their capacity to exercise it, but it doesn't seem to mind if they're harmed in the process. That's a contradiction. On the one hand, they do exactly what they claim harms others. One of the ways that the anti-family ideologies that I've just talked about impacts parents and families is the corruption of the child's best interest. Child's best interests is a key idea, key focus in family laws, where parents go to seek remedies for the alienation of their children. So the first aspect of that is that in some jurisdictions, particularly here in Australia, there are proposals to remove the presumption of shared parenting and care from our family law system. This removes any idea of a family from family law. So you have a family law that has no families in it. Well, that's not a family law, actually. It's something else. That devalues the idea of family relationships as being the best for children. Goes back to the previous point that that's a core factor in that ideology, which means that children can be cut adrift from their parents, also because children say so, because they get to decide. The other corruption is that parents and caregivers have a responsibility to their children and their children's rights, according to the United Nations Charter of the Rights of the Child, but they have no right to exercise it, despite the fact that the Charter of Rights includes a state responsibility to parents. So parents are denied the capacity to exercise their responsibilities. That is a way of legalising the abolishment of families. Child's best interests, I would suggest, has been hijacked by these ideologies. The family laws are littered with false claims of family violence that are actually deliberately misleading. And there is research to suggest that a very high proportion, up to 25% of such claims, are deliberately false, deliberately misleading, and designed to mislead the judge. We see more and more the weaponising of conditions like neurodiversity and gender diversity. Now, these are areas that are claimed to be sources of oppression or subject to oppression in families because they fall outside of the values of parents who don't understand what neurodiversity is and what gender diversity is, and don't understand sexuality either. So historically, same-sex orientation was actually frowned upon in families, and so people who were sexually diverse, gender diverse, neurodiverse were treated as being ill or fell outside of family values. Now, that's a change that's happening more and more in our society. We're coming to accept in various ways how to deal with this and how to respond in more equitable, equal ways. But it's being weaponized in an alienation space. I've talked already about adultifying children, promoting them into adult roles, and to make adult statements they don't have the capacity to exercise. That's an alienating behaviour. The issue with the child's best interests is that it conceals the exploitation around alienation, the way children's relationships are monetised, the deals that parents are encouraged to make for their children to have a relationship with them involve the exchange of assets. There's a price tag on their children. And a classic example is providing more money to a parent in exchange for spending more time with their children. Child support is a great example that parents are legally obliged, legally responsible to pay child support, but the state is not responsible for ensuring there's a relationship that accompanies it. Now, the effect of this is a cash for kids idea that turns the children into an asset or a liability. It objectifies children, turns them into a commodity that's traded. It reduces alienated parents to a bank account and a wallet. So the state, in effect, collaborates with alienation. Often the state finds themselves in a position of justifying bad parenting in the child's best interest by leaving children in the care of parents they know are harming them for want of a solution to the problem. The ideology that's being perpetuated now is that somehow removing a child from an abusive parent is harmful to the child. It is not. If you don't remove them from that parent, you are collaborating with their abuse. So let's move on and talk about one of the tools of the anti-parental alienation, anti-family political agenda, and that is the use of propaganda. Now, I've got a few statements here we've pulled out of a report that's being used to persuade legislators and policymakers to turn against parental alienation informed remediations for children, to turn against the science of parental alienation, to turn against having family laws deal with parental alienation as a type of child psychological abuse and coercive controlling family violence. So I've got a couple of examples here, the way the anti-family groups, anti-family lobbies, organisations, their political ideas selectively appropriate science. So on the one hand, they accept that there are parents who do in fact deliberately damage a child's relationship with their parents. They don't want to call it alienation. They want to call it coercive control. Well, actually, it is a form of coercive control. But they're appropriating the science to suit their political agenda. And what they really want to say is that we'll accept that it's coercive control when it's used against women. We won't accept it as alienation when it's used against men. They are using disinformation to disguise their true agenda. They want to shape people's views, arouse visceral emotional reactions against a practice of remediating child psychological abuse by alienation by making false statements. When reversing care and responsibility in severe cases of parental alienation, we do not force children into contact with a parent who is abusing them. We give children the chance of remediating a relationship with a parent who's going to nurture them. This is a completely false statement, but it's presented as though it is true. The idea that parental alienation has been disproven keeps recurring through multiple channels across multiple oppositional organisations. It is patently false. There's enough solid science behind parental alienation that it's simply not worth repeating it. It's a very clever tactic. If you repeat false information through multiple repeated channels, you triangulate the audience with the same false information through different ways of hearing it. It therefore comes across as true. It's a form of coercion. It's called perspecticide, and it's designed to take control of how you think and make you think their way. So another falsity that's presented as plausible but is actually fallacious is this idea around sexual abuse claims that judges will automatically assume that an unsubstantiated claim means that the child has been alienated. And that's simply not the case. Judges do in fact differentiate very clearly between unsubstantiated claims and deliberately false claims. Now, it is possible to make a claim of sexual abuse of a child but not have adequate proof or to have misinterpreted certain behaviours. So the abuse didn't happen the way it was claimed. Certainly something may have happened. That doesn't mean that the claim is deliberately misleading. Deliberately misleading claims are quite unique. They can be differentiated. Judges are alert to that. But obviously people making deliberately misleading claims won't be happy that they got caught out. So these are the tactics that we see common to organisations and ideologies that seek to overturn parental alienation as a valid science and a valid theory and concept of social violence by alienation. So where are we now in this current state of society and families? Parental alienation is actually a form of social alienation in families, but we are in a society, a state of society right now that is alienating. And when I say alienating, it means that it separates us from the means of fulfilling our social goals and aspirations. So the most obvious form in a family is a parent who has that social role in their relationships in the family, but is not only unable to exercise them, but is stigmatized, marginalized, and excluded because of that. One reason why there's so much opposition to parental alienation as a concept, theory, and a practice is because of the way it challenges anti-family ideologies and holds them accountable. So holding them accountable means that an allegation of family violence or child sexual abuse has to be tested. It's not assumed to be true up front. Another way it challenges them is that parental alienation as a concept, theory, and practice is non-gendered, is non-sexualized. It doesn't care what gender you are. It doesn't care what your sexual orientation is. It doesn't care what sort of family you have. It only cares that your child has a relationship with their parents and caregivers, whoever they are, and a relationship with their extended family, whoever they are. So it does actually promote a child-focused family model in society. And of course, because it is scientifically based, we are alert to the contradictions of ideology, the way they use the same methods that they criticize in others. So here we are in the second decade of the 21st century with a profound change in the nature of families based on institutional power or structural power to relationship power. So on the one hand, family members, particularly women, are freed from those abuses of institutional power that normalise, for example, sexual abuse against women, family violence against women, but now exposes everyone to the abuses of power in relationships. It exposes us to relationship abuse, hence coercive control, intimate partner violence. Danger, of course, is to replace one form of oppression with another. The nature of this utopia is such that it's simply oppressive in a different form. So what should the field of parental alienation stand for, and what should it stand against? So we stand for family relationships that build society, that are equitable, equal, and nurturing of children. We want children to have relationships with all of their parents, caregivers, and family members. Parents need to be able to exercise those responsibilities to fulfill that need and have the right to do so. And the state should support them in doing so. There are no conditions on family relationships. They are unconditionally loving. It's the notion of loving, nurturing relationships that foster togetherness and connectedness. That is what we stand for. There's no division between child support and parent-child relationships. You can't have one without the other, because to provide child support without the relationship does not demonstrate support for togetherness, for connectedness. Even if a parent lives away from the child, they should still have contact with that child, still spend time with that child, and that child should enjoy their relationship with them. If there has been family violence and that parent has justifiably been ejected from the family, why would you want their money? And so we want equity and equality in power and relationships in the family. What we stand against is replacing the family with the state, of allowing children to reject a parent without a reason and to have no intervention or remediation of that. We stand against the idea that parents should have responsibility to their children but can't exercise their rights to do so. So in other words, you disempower parents from being the parents. We don't want the state to mediate relationships through institutions like the family law. Families need to have the independence and autonomy to bring up their children as they see fit within a broader social environment, but also has values and beliefs that interact with families. We're absolutely against the weaponizing of health issues, mental health issues, and sexuality, gender, neurodiversity, etc. We also stand against objectifying children, commodifying children, turning them into assets They have dollar values attached to it. And this is an amorality around alienation. It's the whatever it takes idea. The ends justify the means. When we see that practice in families, we know children are in grave danger because it can lead to fatal and violent outcomes. We see no distinction between gender in access to power and relationships. The idea of privilege associated with gender needs to go away. The big difference between what we stand for and what we stand against, we stand for having a moral compass for the family. And that moral compass comes from inside the family and also across families in our society, in our communities, whatever they may be. They work together, they interact together, and they develop together. What we stand against is amorality, no moral compass, where anything goes in the pursuit of an ideological outcome that is doomed to be a dystopia rather than a utopia. Where does that leave us? I've previously introduced the concept of de-alienation. We are in a post-truth world. The truth exists objectively outside the experience of the people who perceive it. We can't actually necessarily see that. Post-truth world relies solely on subjectivity, on relationships to mediate what is a reality and what isn't. This means we're constantly moving. Things are constantly changing. Everything's precarious in relationships, in our identities, because they're all tied together. Unfortunately, we've solved one problem but created others. And that is that relationships and identity are now a form of property. They're traded, particularly when a family separates. Who has what relationship or what type of relationship is a trade. It's a game, unfortunately, that has nothing to do with the child's best interest. The way to deal with that is to focus on what I call substantive, loving relationships. The institution of the family, the solid structure, continues to evolve in this era, in this century. But the one thing that stays the same is the quality of the relationships that we have with our children, with each other. And that is the ongoing mission for alienated parents. What empowers them is to focus on that loving, nurturing relationship that fosters connectedness and togetherness that helps children develop. And that is the moral high ground on which we stand. Thank you for your time today. We'll be talking again soon on the next subject.
In next week's episode of Families Divided TV, Susan Schofer discusses keeping your ego out of parental alienation resolution.